And we're recording. Okay, brilliant. So just to introduce me quickly, I'm Andy Brogan, one of the people who founded Next Stage Radicals. So as I was just explaining to a couple of you earlier, Next Stage Radicals is really just a community of practice, a bunch of people who various of us bumped into each other along the way, thought, oh, that's cool, we like what you're doing. And we agreed to get together to just chuck stuff on a shared website. And it's kind of grown from there. So there are people in the Next Stage Radicals community that I don't know at all, but who others in the group do know, and are just cool people doing cool things. So that's Next Stage Radicals. And the idea behind it really is to try and share stuff that feels interesting, feels sort of like it's pushing at the boundaries of how things work today, and pushing in a direction that's about kind of creating a better world for us all. These particular events have grown out of that, where basically we've just invited someone, in this case Alex, but someone from the Next Stage Radicals community each month to host a session which is talking about their area of particular interest, and hopefully going beyond just kind of a presentation into it being a live exploration and discussion. So we're kind of arriving here, not assuming ourselves to be experts, but just assuming ourselves to be curious and having an area of interest. So hopefully you're going to have lots to bring to this and to say. We're really interested to sort of see where it leads us. I think without much further ado than that, I'm going to shut up and hand over to Alex, who will provide just a few sort of prompting thoughts to get us off and motoring, and then we'll take it from there. So over to you, Alex.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Andy. Hi, Tabitha. Her relevance will become very clear shortly. Well, she's training me in nature coaching, so let's spoil a surprise early. So thank you everyone very much for joining this. I was in two minds about how to run this, but as is my want today, is to go with the flow and keep it as natural as possible. So as you would expect. So I'm going to try and keep this fairly light, and there's a little bit of structure, but not too much, and just to see where we go, but probably largely dealt with by your reflections and your involvement and your questions as well. But I'm going to introduce myself a little bit to explain my history, and Andy, I don't know, keep me down to 5 minutes. I'm determined, because I can talk a lot if given the opportunity. But I will try and have some discipline about what's got me here today, I suppose, and why this is important to me, just to give you a bit of flavour of my context, my history, my background. But then really what the interesting piece for me is to do, and this is an experiment, is to do a coaching session using nature with Andy, who's kindly agreed to be guinea pig in this. So we're going to experiment, and I would say it's focusing on the nature element of coaching. So some coaching, but largely around how you can use nature to reflect on yourself. So I'm going to ask Andy after the introduction piece to think about a problem that he's facing, and go through an exercise with that. And this is not a usual environment, but Tabitha will know that when we do our training, it's a very reflective process where you can sort of uncover things and explore the inner dialogues and so on that are going. So what I'd like to invite Andy to do, and myself, is to explore, is to sort of dissect the experience. What was it like for you, as it were, after you've done the coaching, to see how that's worked and how feelings have emerged, and what you were thinking and feeling as we go through things. So I need to ground myself, because it's making me slightly nervous thinking about it, as it's not a conventional sort of way of doing things. But I think it should be more enlightening for everyone who's participating, to get a bit of a, dissect this sort of how do you use nature, put it on the table, and have a look at that by experiencing it. But I'll also invite you, as far as is possible, to think about perhaps something that's front of your mind at the moment that you're challenged with, and maybe answer the questions that are posed as you go through it, which is going to be, I think, possible to a degree, but obviously it's to deal with Andy's sort of situation. So, but to a degree that will be something, if you can try and follow through yourself, that will be make it more experiential for you, I guess. Excuse me. So I don't know if this has ever been done before. So that's the plan. And I want to see where the coach, the questions and the exploration goes afterwards, rather than having anything too concrete. But then I want to finish off with some resources to share. Tabitha's book, which I'll be sharing as well, so you can got some things to take away with you to put into practice yourselves as well. So that's the plan. So to start with, so reflecting on my history. So I'm used to describe myself as a recovering business analyst. Spent 20 years working in as a contractor in mostly financial services by accident rather than by design. And in the last few years, I've gone through quite a growth spurt, I suppose, as you might say. Apparently, you're not really supposed to do it when you're 50, are you? I don't think traditionally, but I don't think that's probably not true. So I've been going through quite a growth period for me the last 3 years, triggered in part by my work experiences, but also through my experiences reflecting on the larger problems we're facing in society at the moment with the climate crisis, which is not the only ones, and other things that have come into sharp relief recently. So I guess I've been reflecting on two questions. So I've been working for Lloyds Banking Group up until a few months ago, helping to transform their organisation. And there's two questions that have sort of carried me through this period as like, excuse me, is how do you transform an organisation so that it is a place where people can thrive, which for me is a personal motivation, not necessarily an explicit part of what they were trying to achieve, but I think a requirement, if you like, for it to be successful. But also it's more effective. So it's not there's no paradox there. There's no either or necessarily. It's almost where people can thrive as a precondition for an organisation to be more effective. And I was reflecting on me and my own journey and feeling of lack of thriving, if you like, being limited in my experiences at work and being shut into a box in terms of my role, which I'll come back to a bit later briefly. But there was another question that I was looking at the same time, which I didn't think was really connected. Well, it wasn't. It was just a different question, which says, what were we thinking that has led us to the point that we're destroying our home? So the climate crisis, what on earth literally were we thinking? And as I've discovered, it's not, thinking is almost a bit too narrow. Maybe that's the answers in the question. It's just about what we're thinking, we weren't feeling. So those two sort of things are sort of parallel journey for me, converged at some point. And I would say that it was, it was quite a lot of reflecting. I mean, I read a lot of books. So when you're going through this transformation stuff in organizations, you read a lot of books. There's always another book with another answer to another problem that you were left with by the previous book you read. And I just thought, this is going to take a bloody long time. This can't be right. There must be a more effective way of doing this. And as an actually lazy person, which was all called the sort of entrepreneurial, I think, characteristic, I wanted to get to the heart of the matter. What are the basic principles we're operating here? If I understand the principles, then I'm much better placed to then adapt the practices that I apply. And if the principles stay constant, then that's a much more powerful place to get to. So that's, I guess, was sort of what I was thinking, is what are the underlying principles operating. And I don't want to go into all the details really, but I suppose the conclusion I came to, and this is where things started to converge, was that when you're looking at an organizational transformation, the principles we all operate by, and you might intellectually agree with this, is like natural principles. They're a natural law that's operating, that sort of intuitively that must be right. We're all part of nature, aren't we? So as long as we understand what that natural law must be, then we're good. We can just operate by that, which felt like a good place to come to. And it also connected with disconnection. So some of you may have read Charles Eisenstein's the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, which is quite a difficult title to remember. But I read that last summer, 2019, and that message in there very strong, and he's not the only person saying this by a long shot, is around reconnecting with nature, which is in itself paradoxical if you are nature, but that basically we have become disconnected to a degree where that is the heart of our problems. So these sort of two lines were sort of converging, and then then I realized, and then there was this idea about, well, organizational transformation should be driven by natural law as well, natural principles. So it was easy. I found the answer I could give up at that point. But it turns out it's quite difficult to do that. There was a period I've got the principles, the design principles for permaculture, which some of you may be aware of, and I actually printed them out and stuck in my back pocket. I used to take them to work because then I could look at them and say, "Oh, that's that principle." And it was quite difficult to do. It was quite difficult to translate. So you've got principle, but whether it's a shortcoming in our sort of mental process or a sort of blind spot, it's actually quite difficult to translate those into the human realm, if you like. So I thought I had the answer, but I didn't know what those principles were. I didn't necessarily know how to translate them, but I had a few inklings. So I suppose one of the things, so an easy example is diversity. So nature values diversity. And I found my experience was I had stopped learning in the organization I was in. So I was, and I think it's called value the marginal really in permaculture principles, because that's where two ecosystems come together and where the intermingling takes place. So when you call value the marginal, then you see two ecosystems, two very different ecosystems coming together, and new plants emerging, new sort of species emerging. And I guess I was in the corporate monoculture where there were new ideas. I mean, in theory, we're in quite a creative space because we're transforming the organization, but I reached a limit where I really didn't feel I was learning anything more, and other than the fact that we appear to be stopping and slowing and not really reaching the point or seeing progress towards making it an organization where people can thrive. So I found I found some insight from working in the charitable sector. I found some insight from just finding people who I'd never met before who had some pretty strange ideas and just talking to them. So there was I recorded some conversations last year with a friend called Hillary and a Dutch gentleman called Bard. I recorded those, which are probably the least viewed YouTube videos online, but we would literally go into a conversation with no agenda whatsoever and see what emerged. And because they were both very open-minded, I guess, and very passionate about getting to the heart of the problem and understanding there were some significant problems with society based on their experiences, we would explore things and often look at things like indigenous wisdoms, for example. So that was me getting some diversity into my mix, if you like, in terms of ideas. So just an example of how I started thinking differently and questioning assumptions, really becoming more aware of what was going on around me, and what you take as a given, you don't even know is an assumption, is actually something that's ultimately challenged. So that's the sort of thing I did, amongst other things. I'm happy to talk about that some more, but I won't unless invited. But I just wanted to touch on the point of this talk as well. So how nature can lead us back to nature to create ways of organising together in greater harmony. Now, my personal example of that was being frustrated in my role and have been for some time, thinking this is not giving me the opportunity to do what I want to do. So there's like a resonance problem. It was dissonant. I was unhappy with that. It wasn't working for me any longer. I wasn't able to be myself. So I knew my nature was being suppressed, if you like, to a degree where the compromise had shifted too far. So we have a relationship between me and the organization, and it should be a symbiotic relationship, if you like, but it wasn't. It was now I was caged, locked in a box. I use metaphors like that to talk about this. And but the paradox and the sort of the the wake up factor was realizing that the organization was actually asking me to step outside that box in a slightly obscure way, but I was saying there's things like T-shaped skills, which is indicating you should have more skills, which I think is about possibly cost cutting rather than anything. But it's basically recognizing people are more than this box, this work shape, role shape box we've given them. Well, they're not more than, they are not that at all. They are themselves. But the paradox for me was realizing, well, the organization seems to want me to do a bit of that. I'm invited to step outside this box-ish, mostly. And actually, as I look at all the methodologies that they're applying, so you've got agile methodologies, you've got design thinking, they're all about untapping human creativity. They're about going with flow, allowing things to emerge, not predicting the future, recognizing you can't control things by planning things. That just doesn't work. That doesn't work in nature, it doesn't work in these organizations. And then realizing, well, did it ever work? Why are we even in this situation in the first place? I mean, and actually it was, there's a level of suppressed anger in there because of, which is reflected by whenever I look at a job application these days, is normally I can feel myself be walking into a cage again. So that was my big insight was, well, this doesn't work for the organization or for me. It's not just about me being selfish, if you like, it's about the organization being effective. And it does open other questions about what is the point of that? Is this about control for control's sake? And I'm not going to go down that path, but you can sort of, you can take that as far as you wish, whether it's about people being controlled about what's being effective for organizations. So that was a sort of dissonance, I suppose, I was feeling. And then we went into systems thinking, which is sort of the response to this, is looking at things as systems, which is interesting, but it's also quite sometimes a bit obscure, and it's not very easy for people to get into this. There are a lot of barriers, and I consider myself open-minded and wanting to grow and learn, so very motivated. But I was thinking, a lot of people I want to speak to they just don't have the appetite to explore this stuff. So I suppose this is where nature comes in again, because nature is the ultimate system and the ultimate teacher. And people, I feel, generally relate to nature, whether they do when it comes to the detail, whether it's like a feeling, but there is a resonance with nature. And we could talk about biophilia, love of nature, sort of established as being a thing. So it sort of reinforced my idea of coming back to using nature to provide inspiration and provide examples of systems and help trigger change, which leads me to nature coaching. So I discovered Earth Self and Tabitha at the start of the year. I think gave her a call on the phone. About 2 hours later, I realized that maybe this is something I wanted to follow up with. So we'd never spoken before, but there's clearly a lot of resonance there. So that's been my response, if you like, is nature coaching. But it's more about the coaching being a way of engaging with nature and helping you act upon that and give you to go forward from the insights that are generated by exposure to nature. So that's my briefish introduction, which leads me to back to Andy to have a crack at some coaching. And let's emphasize on nature here, but I will attempt to demonstrate some coaching skills, which is usually things like creating safety. But I'm thinking that Andy's been here for doing this for quite a while, so it's a relatively comfortable environment for him. How are you feeling about this, Andy?
I am comfortable, but I think just because I tend to wear things on my sleeve fairly often, so that's not a problem. But I have to say the idea of being coached in public on an issue that is probably going to be quite deep is moderately intimidating. So, but it's all good. I'm up for it.
Okay. Yeah. And you can choose, you can choose the direction we go. So, and indeed, whatever you want to talk about, whatever you want to explore. So, let's keep it safe as best we can. Tabitha can use this in her in future training lessons of what to do and what not to do. But what I'd invite everyone else to do is to sort of listen to this and go through the process in parallel, if you like. because it is quite sort of almost like, can be quite, if you like, problem neutral when you reflect on nature, because nature is a mirror. And what I'm going to do, what my instinct is telling me, so is to talk very briefly about the exercise I did the other week with Tabitha, just to provide an illustration. So the other week we actually reflected on nature, and we all happened to have this plant called the silver squill, myself, Tabitha, and Jim, and talked about this plant and use it as a mirror for our own experiences. So effectively, that's the sort of thing we're going to explore, is using nature as a mirror. So it's not specific to the problem you want to explore. So what is it you're drawn to? What comes to mind, Andy, for something you want to explore today?
As a problem or as something in nature?
Something that for you, what's important for you?
So I think there's an issue that's been ongoing for me, which is that so for those of you that aren't aware, I'm a management consultant to trade, and I guess what I observe often is that things that people want to buy or find easy to buy are not necessarily things that I'm interested in providing, which links somewhat to the things you've already introduced. You know, I'm kind of interested in organizational development, but I'm interested in it through the lens of how do we create frictionless human to human relationships, so organizations and as emergent outcomes of relationships. And that's, for most people that I come across, that's quite a difficult thing for them to buy or conceptualize buying. So there's a friction there for me of, you know, needing to keep food on the table, do purposeful work, etc.
Well, something resonates for me, certainly.
Yeah.
So what is it about the friction?
So there are a couple of dimensions to it. I'm in a pretty fortunate position financially, generally. So I have a degree of freedom that probably a lot of people don't have. But I also have business partners, and I feel a responsibility there. So one element of the friction is feeling a responsibility to kind of pull my weight within the business, financially speaking. I think another element is that partly because of being fortunate, my wife hasn't had to work for a number of years, but actually there's there's a question there at the minute around that. Would be one way to reduce this friction for me personally, would be to have that second income, but that would amplify other frictions, you know, because the kids have for certain benefited from, you know, Helen, my wife, being around, and she's not particularly rushing back to the career that she was in, you know. So that's another, it's not a tension between us at all, but it's another thing that, you know, has a friction in my own thinking. Is, you know, should I just swallow hard and do the things that people are prepared to pay for and therefore maintain the lifestyle and all the rest of it? Or is it okay to maybe be more selfish and do something that feels truer to me? But that might mean Helen going back to work. And again, the other thing is, actually, to date, one way or another, I've been able to kind of, at the end of each year, kind of get it over the line. It just never feels safe. So it's a, you know, it's a great first world problem, right? That I've got, but it's a point of stress is the simple thing, and it's primarily that stress of income security, which I don't feel acutely because of the fortunate position I'm in, but I feel it almost on a lag, because it's more like, you know, looking towards kids going to uni or towards retirement or those things that are in the future. I don't want to waste the good position I'm in by not dealing with this now.
Okay, so you've got some breathing space, if you like, and you want you want to feel safe. So what sort of comes to mind if you want to sort of take a breath or two, take a deep breath and think about what comes to mind from nature when you think about what it would be like to be safe? What are you attracted to? What comes to your mind?
So when I think of times in nature when I am not feeling like this, I'm feeling like the opposite of this. I think of myself in my garden in the summertime. I think of myself, I've got a hammock that I string up between two apple trees. So I think of myself sort of lying there, looking up through the branches, feeling warm. I don't know if this is quite nature, but usually with a gin and tonic somewhere nearby.
Nature.
I guess sticking with images of nature that it brings to mind, you know, lying in that hammock, seeing the light coming through the branches. Also, I'll have my hands in the grass quite often, picking out little bits of clover or, you know, that sort of thing. And I think particularly something that has struck me when I've been in that position is actually more than the sights or feelings or smells of nature, it's the sounds. Because the odd thing is the office I'm in right now, the garden's there and it's single pane glass. And I've noticed that when I go out of the house into the garden, if I manage to just calm myself, suddenly I'm tuned into a completely different soundscape than the one that I've noticed was going on. So just hearing the birds or the, you know, the wind in the leaves or those sorts of things. So again, imagining myself back in that hammock, I think actually probably the two sensations that come to mind are warmth and that sound, that sort of quiet bird song and rustle of leaves.
Okay. And what's that? What insights is that giving you to the safety you're looking for in terms of your current situation and the breathing space you're utilizing at the moment?
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So I guess the two things I've picked out, the warmth and the sound. On the warmth, what that brings to mind is the degree to which I find not just the business environment, but actually I find the environment in society quite generally quite hostile, if I'm honest. And again, I almost want to caveat that with how fortunate I know I am, but you know, Alex, because we've talked recently about this in other fora, but I find myself incredibly sad actually at you know, the environment that's out there at the minute. So that feeling of warmth, I think, is juxtaposed with that sense of it being quite. It's not necessarily cold, but it sort of feels adversarial and combative, and it feels like, you know, that it's hard to go and find comfort and just relax, either in the business environment or, as I say, the social environment. And maybe COVID's playing into that somewhat as well, because those social spaces aren't as available. So that's what comes to mind with the warm thing. With the bird song. I mean, that one was quite interesting to me when it just reflected on it, because I guess what I'm aware of, particularly between my garden and the office environment, is even though I'm sat in this room on my own, you know, and, you know, kids are at school and all the rest of it. So it's essentially silent. I feel like there's relentless noise. It's noise in there, I think. It's the noise of the stress. But I feel like there is constant chatter. And actually, we touched on social media just as we were sort of getting acquainted at the start here. And one of the things I sort of essentially deeply resent about the way the consulting world seems to work now is that if you're not on social media, you're essentially invisible. So I feel like I have to be in social media, but it's the last place I want to be because it doesn't give me that sense of warmth. So it doesn't feel like genuine social connection. And it does give me a real sense of amplified noise because I feel like I go on there and what I see is really, even in people I really, really respect, but I see this sort of arms race of ideas going on that I find disheartening because even though I accept on things like Twitter, there is a collaborative element in there. I find it hard to experience it that way. I tend to experience it more as posturing and staking out intellectual territory and those sorts of things. And I find that, just to be completely transparent, I find it abhorrent, but I also am conscious that I do some of it myself because it feels like that's the rules of the game. And I just don't want to be in that game.
So you, it sounds like I'm hearing you want to, that's quite evocative for me. You want to change the game. You want to be in a different game, where you're feeling that warmth and you're hearing that bird song. What is coming to mind about steps you might take to create that safety?
So I think I'm taking some of them, but I guess part of the reason I'm raising this is I feel like I'm not either being as effective in them as I could be, or that I might be missing some obvious opportunities. So some of the things I am doing, I guess this is an example of one of them, trying to create spaces with and for other people that don't feel particularly owned. That's the idea behind Next Stage Radicals, is that it's in the ownership of that community and it will live as long as the community is interested in being part of it. So for me, that has been, I think, a good island of sanity, to borrow I've forgotten the lady's name. Anyway, great public speaker who talks about islands of sanity. So for me, Next Stage Radicals has been an example of that. I've got another group that I'm part of, Society 2045, that's been a good example of that. And I guess what I've noticed about both of those groups is, in a sense, they've been islands of sanity, but they've also almost amplified the dissonance because they provide a point of comparison. So what I've observed about them is they've convened essentially as human-to-human communities of practice, if you like, where people turn up with what matters to them and we support each other, and that feels really good to me. That feels like it speaks to all the things that I'm describing. But then stepping out of those into a work environment where instead of starting with a community of humans, it seems to start with an organization's intent. And I suddenly find myself saying, well, I know where we're going to end up here, is we're going to end up needing a community of humans to deal with all the dysfunctions of this program environment. So I think some of the things I'm doing, to come back to your question, are helping but also amplifying my sense of dissonance, because I'm kind of finding things that I'm really enjoying, but those are not things that pay the bills. They're just things that keep me sane while I have to worry about how to pay the bills.
I missed some of that, Andy, which isn't great for coaching. Apologies. So I might come in with a clumsy question of in the interest of giving people time to us to reflect on this and to answer questions. What's the one thing that's coming to mind you'd like to do next?
So I think from this, a couple of things come to mind, and they're linked back to that warmth and birdsong stuff, actually, which has been quite helpful to bring that to mind. So on the birdsong bit, which I'm sort of feeling as the noise going away, tuning into a different sound. I think one of the things I can do immediately is just take more responsibility for not tuning into that noise at times. So switching off the phone at certain periods, or being maybe more deliberate around when I do and don't use social media and those sorts of things. So I think there's probably some utility in taking some responsibility for that. On the warmth side of things, for me, that kind of equates to this sense of fellowship that I sometimes have mentioned to you in the past, and real human connection. And actually, this conversation has felt like a good example of that. So I think one of the things, again, I could maybe take responsibility for is with people that I know would be open to it, being prepared to have this sort of conversation with them, and inviting them to do similar in response if they feel comfortable. So I think they're things that feel within my control. I think they don't. I don't think they resolve the root cause of the tension that I'm feeling, but they would definitely help deal with the symptoms, if that makes any sense.
It does, yeah. We may want to explore this further. He says, covering himself, but I think we'll finish there, if that's all right. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks for that, Alex. I enjoyed that and found it useful.
Good, thank you very much. So I was want to ask people to raise their questions or reflections in a moment. Maybe you can raise your hands if you're not visible using the chat or something. But I just wanted to ask just a question, which I think he's probably going to answer quite quickly. Is is there anything you went through? Are there any feelings and sensations you were quite open about it? To be honest with you, so there may have been nothing to add. But was there anything else that you felt as you were going through that? Inside that maybe you didn't articulate?
So I think because this is quite present for me anyway at the minute, what I've described, I think the feelings are quite near the surface. So I do have that feeling of sadness that I mentioned. That feels quite close to the top. And it's accompanied by an occasional feeling of anger, if I'm honest. And not in an intellectual way, but there is also, I think, a quite embodied feeling of feeling a little bit frustrated at myself, because I think, again, I recognize that actually I'm in a pretty good position, and there's a little bit of me that thinks that holds a tension between wanting to say to myself, just grow up, and at the same time wanting to say, but actually some of what this is doing is giving me a fire to try and do things that I think are important things to do. So they're all emotions that are going on.
Okay, thanks, Andy. So who would have a question or observation they want to contribute? To raise your hand. Rachel.
Actually, I'd like to ask Andy a question, if that's okay. You said at first, I wrote it down because it was really shut out at me. Why do you think that purposeful work is selfish?
Yeah, great question. So I think what I meant by that was the sort of life we've built together in my family has been based on me being the primary sort of money earner, and I could keep doing what I've been doing and keep bringing home that quantum of money, if you like. So that's where there's a slight feeling of, is it selfish to sort of say, well, actually, I'm prepared to put that level of earning at risk, but that has implications for others, while I pursue something I see as more purposeful.
Got it, yeah, understand. And I think that's where a lot of people sit in this, like between kind of an old world and a and moving into a next new world. I think loads of people resonate with that for sure.
Yeah, I definitely think I'm not alone on this one, right? So.
Is there any questions about the sort of process for either of us, or what Andy felt or experienced? Go.
Hello. That was really lovely. Thank you for sharing that, both of you. For me, it was an observation. And I really liked sort of, for me, it's the first time I've seen this type of coaching, and bringing nature into the conversation. It felt like it was an invitation to be gentle with yourself. And I got the sense that that gentleness with yourself is not sort of out there in the workplace, in the sort of, you know, traditional business place. And that sort of felt really powerful.
As the person who experienced it, I felt it that way, for what it's worth. If I'm completely transparent, I sort of wondered, where is this going to take me? What am I going to feel as I first started talking about the garden? And then almost like just that thing of warmth and birdsong just completely tuned me into something. So that was really interesting.
Thanks, Joe. And I think one of the pieces I've learned is around nature is gentle. So that is part of the process, and allowing things to happen. They need to be quite as abrupt as we want. You know, we want to solve problems and move from here to here, whereas actually it's the gradual process. That's a more natural process. Anna, I think you raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask how you felt like the coaching environment would make a difference. You know, like obviously we're doing it across Zoom right now, but like if you were going for a walk in the woods, would you try and like set something like that up where you can actually have that first-hand experience whilst you're coaching, and go through and like talk about the different things that you see and feel? And I wonder if that was something you were considering.
Is that a question for Andy?
No, for yourself.
No, for me. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. How does it compare to going for a walk in the woods, or rather than coaching?
If you were to like do this, the ideal would be face to face. But then if you could be outside with that,
right.
You be like planning to incorporate some of those kind of more tangible moments.
Sure, and I should say that the premise behind this is that for the research that Tabitha has done is basically around the premise that it's not very practical to be doing that. So perhaps the ideal is to be doing a walk in the woods, and indeed you should be, but not necessarily, you know, alongside your coach, if you like. And the premise is that this is a practical way of bringing nature into the coaching conversation without necessarily being in present. Having said that, there would be an encouragement to spend time in nature outside that. And you know, I've spoken to people recently and said, you know, it's almost said coaching is about, the coaching is to how do you get in touch with nature, right? Or why don't you go for a walk, or next time before we can reflect on that. And even that's quite enlightening, because I've come in with a go for a walk. That's what I like to do, and that's what you like to do. And then it turns out there's a whole nature attraction piece. What are you drawn to? And it turned out my brother was drawn to the basil plant in his kitchen. He's more than happy to talk about his basil plant, but the 2 hours he spent walking in a wood just didn't do anything for him at all. So there's a really important point about you can't force it. It's about what you're drawn to, but you can then bring it into the coaching conversation in a very sort of metaphorical way there, but also actual. It can be an actual way. So that's why I write quite a lot on Medium, just to sort of say what came up for me when I was walking through the woods today, to sort of demonstrate, if you like. Does anyone else have any observations or questions?
I like this idea of how whatever you're drawn to is the thing that you kind of almost the answer to your question is what it felt like with what Andy said. And really, in the bird song, was craving that kind of quiet sound.
And it creates distance as well. So you're removed from the problem at hand. So it's easier to approach from a distance, to approach these problems and taps into. I feel like I feel very much like I'm pretending to be Tabitha now, but it's very much like you come at it from a safe distance, and then that you can go into the theory, which I'm trying not to, but you can sort of tap into the unconscious through that way, and there is plenty of research on that basis. But nature is a whole different, I don't know, twist on things. So it's that gentleness. I feel I want to add though, from my own experience, because it is about reflecting what it feels like. I was quite tense. So just so you know, it's and part of this is not for Andy, it's for all of us. So it's for me equally. I need to be present in the moment, grounded, all those good things, because then I can tune in and be more almost like a channel, to be honest with you, and not allow my stuff to get in the way, which will sort of show in if it gets a bit jarring. But I was slightly tense but relaxed with it, if you know what I mean, because that's okay. That's just sort of observing the natural situation, which is slightly artificial and not really in the handbook, so it's fine.
Yeah, I thought it was quite a brave thing to do, actually, Alex, because it's not easy to coach at the best of times, never mind in front of a bunch of people and with someone you've never coached before as well. But I appreciated it. I don't know if you spotted there's a question gone into the chat as well from Anna there.
Alongside a client's experience of nature, how might this process relate, if at all, to the biomimicry design approach? Looking for how nature itself would solve the problem raised by the client. I think very much. I mean, in the sense, it's only from my own personal experience. It is about opening yourself up to new ideas and spending time in nature, reflecting. You just do start to see patterns. It makes it a lot easier to let them come through. I was talking about, my permaculture design principles, which didn't really particularly work for me. But I've been reading ridiculous amounts on mycelium recently, and you realise that, you realise the connection. You realise that mycelium and the way it operates is actually not so different. Yeah, it's a great film, fantastic fungi, isn't it? It's not so different. It's actually, there are some principles operating here which are similar. And I struggle a little to articulate that, but there are patterns and that you can see. But I feel you can see them more openly when you start more directly relating to and connecting to nature without actually watching a film or reading a book, potentially. It's nice to get that sort of the mental, intellectual support, but actually going out and spending. I mean, I've written about looking at a plant that was apparently died, and it gave me, and then came back to life because it wasn't actually dead, and that gave me some insights onto the nature of conflict, or maybe the human stories around conflict. And this is actually just growth. This is just plants doing what they do, and we just do what we do. But is more about emotions as a feedback mechanism. Plants have the same feedback mechanisms, but they don't get stuck in them. They tend to hear them and then move on and adapt. So it gives you a whole different perspective on a problem. And those things do pop in your head when you're going for that walk and you're looking at things and being contemplative about it. If that answers your question, Anna.
I'm also wondering, just since you asked the question, Anna, if it's not putting you on the spot, I mean, do you have thoughts on how it applies to that situation? Oh, not able to speak just now. No problem, Anna. Thanks.
If you want, I can come in and
please
share a bit, because it might be useful, and I'll give you a bit of context of why I've joined. I was really excited to actually see Alex doing this, because it is not normal that a student, before they've actually completed the training, decides to go and say, hey, I'm just going to go and get out there and actually do speaking events and hold group energy. So I wanted to come along and support that for Alex, because I'm excited to see him really stepping up and embracing this. And when you're looking at the biomimicry principles there, they are in essence a part of exactly what we're doing in here, connecting with nature, because there's still the principles of biophilia are undermining biomimicry themselves with the design spiral. And what the essence of the design spiral is in biomimicry is, let's look to nature. What is the function that we're wanting to do? So it's not necessarily looking at a problem. So there's a slightly different way, although it overlaps. And it's let's look for the function, and then let's translate it into a non-biological term so that we can create a way for the solution. What we're doing here with a more metaphorical basis is still using that, although when you're applying the biomimicry approach of having what is the biological processes, so it's not just the metaphor, what can you learn from observing how nature is functioning while you're studying it, you can learn on that level as well, and you can have the metaphorical level there as well. So when the framework that I teach, Alex, the nature embodied experiences like these are an integral part, but to weave it all together into a nature connected perspective, it is very much building on how do you constantly be inspired by nature to go there and look for your solutions as well. So it's not just about going for a walk, because that can stay in a very much individualistic perspective. And what we're doing here is very much how do we have that connection and actually see ourselves as part of this greater ecosystem, to then start learning from it, not from a separate perspective of let's embody a mechanistic perspective of split it down and look at it to that way, but from a holistic perspective of what does it mean to experience nature and part life speaking through us as well. So it brings us into a more direct relationship. And I think the point that was really made, which was really nice, is the fact that nature in some ways, just by accessing that memory, it can help you gain the clarity to the problem that you're working on and facing. And even when you're relating this back to biomimicry, you're still using that exact same principle of what is it if you're out studying the function of a tree and how its roots communicate. I mean, I love that one, and we're talking about fungi. How does that work? Well, how do we experience it as we're working? As part of it, not as part of it as a separate. So I hope that kind of explains, without going into too much of it, but highlighting that biomimicry and this approach to coaching are very much connected, and different ways of working and integrating with similar principles.
Thanks, Abby. I'm conscious of time. I'm not too worried about finishing on, well, I am worried about finishing on time because this is supposed to finish at 2, but I'm happy to stay on. Has anyone got any other pressing questions? Because I felt I should share a bit of sort of next steps type stuff with you guys, or what I've used anyway. So I mentioned there's a few books. I mean, as I say, don't read all the books, but if you are going to read any books, then read these books. So if you've not come across it, there was The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know It's Possible, which is Charles Eisenstein. I mean, it's connect to nature, but he goes into a few more words than that. That's what I found quite pivotal for me. And he's done a lot of things online, different forms as well. But and then this book is from a business perspective, this regenerative leadership. Some of you probably read it, yeah, Rachel. Well, I know some of you are doing. I know Rachel's on Giles Hutchins and Laura Storm's training at the moment. But I guess the reasons I raise that particularly is because it's almost ridiculous in that it tries to summarize, the problems of the last 5,000 years or 10,000 years or whatever timescale you want to look at, and his perspective, having spent long periods in huts contemplating and things. But it's like, I mean, and possibly it might be a bit much if you're starting from scratch, but if you want a simple and a more business oriented angle on it, I think it's a good place, a good thing to read. And as I say, I don't want to give you too much to read particularly, but the only other thing I might mention, which is, and I may have mentioned this before, Nature and Body by Tabitha Jane. So in terms of the actual practices in nature, not coaching per se, but if you like, there's much in there. I'm recommending that one, Tabitha, unless you want to recommend the other book particularly. No, okay. And then the other one is, weirdly, because this is how nature works, I was reminded this morning of something someone shared again, on the slightly more practical business organizational level. Kathleen Allen, who you may have come across. If you look up Kathleen Allen, and she's done a TED talk, which was pointed out to me a while back. But if you look up Kathleen, if you go to KathleenAllen.net, she's got a lovely TED video which talks in more practical terms about that. Here's how nature works. Here's how organizations work, and her basic premise is, the same thing. Organizations are based on a mechanistic model, but she looks at it from a leadership point of view. So it's a different perspective, or a slightly different focus, if you like. And it's leading living systems. In fact, I will just quickly show you the post, show the TED link, so you can copy it if you wish. In fact, I was half thinking about using it on this call, but I thought that would be a bit of a cop-out. So it's a very good, you could start with this 50 minutes and say, this is what it means to compare organizations to, real nature, how to sort of reframe things. But anyway, she's, there are going to be a lot more I'm sure you could recommend as well, but those are ones I wanted to bring out that I found particularly useful.
I'll send an email round after this with links to all of that stuff if I can find it all. Put it all in one place for you.
Thanks, Andy.
Cool. Alex, I can see a couple of people are having to start to go. So what I might do is, just from a recording point of view, I'll just wrap us up here. But those that want to stay on and continue to sort of have a chat and explore can do so. I'll send round a recording of this so that you've got it if you want to revisit anything, plus those links. So for those of you that have to go, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time. And also just to say thanks to you, Alex, for doing this and for being gentle with me.
The quote.
Yeah.
Thank you for being the right person to be able to offer that to Andy as well. Thank you.
That's all right. It's a pleasure. Folks, stay on if you'd like to, but otherwise, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.